I mean, should there be a vote on whatever the Prime Minister brings back, Maria Caulfield?
Well, I think let's see what the Prime Minister does bring back, because he was very clear that the deal hasn't been fully agreed yet, and so we need to see what the level of detail is.
But when it does, should there be a vote?
Well, I don't know if there should be a vote. I think, as the Prime Minister said, Parliament will have its say. It will be debated, that's for sure, and there are ways to have votes. So we need to see what the mechanism of that is. But I thought what was very interesting was that the Labour Party don't seem to really have changed their tack on this from the Brexit days, in terms of they will vote anything through just to kind of keep the EU on side. And what is so important in all of this is, in terms of what the DUP is asking, the implications of not sorting this out properly is there is no executive, no functioning assembly in Northern Ireland, and devolved issues like health, education, police are not being dealt with. And that's why it's so important. It's not just a tick box exercise to get the protocol sorted.
Right.
This is about real issues in Northern Ireland.
So should the Prime Minister have got the agreement of the Democratic Unionist Party and its leader Jeffrey Donaldson before embarking on talks with the EU?
I think he needs to get everyone involved, and I think absolutely it's crucial.
Yeah, but he hadn't done, had he, up until now? I mean, it was pretty stark listening to Jeffrey Donaldson. Do you agree with him? It would be unacceptable if Northern Ireland continues to be guided in any way on a legal basis by the laws of the EU.
Well, I think the Prime Minister recognises that that's what the position of the protocol right now.
Do you agree with Jeffrey Donaldson? Would you accept a deal that comes back from Rishi Sunak, that he's agreed with Maros Sefcovic in the EU, that still has the EU guiding some of the customs, some of the regulations, and the European Court of Justice as the final arbiter?
I think the Prime Minister actually hinted at this himself. He said he wants to address those constitutional and democratic issues. And I took from that he takes the DUP's concerns very seriously, and that's part of the work that he's doing with the deal.
I'm really interested that the thing you brought up as an example of what needs to happen here is to get Stormont up and running again. So if the DUP don't, as a result of this deal, agree to power sharing again, is it a failure?
Well, I think it's a failure for the people of Northern Ireland that there isn't a functioning assembly.
You've set yourself a bit of a bar there by saying we need to get Stormont back up and running. That's why we're doing this whole thing. If the DUP turn round and say this isn't enough for us to go back into power sharing, that suggests that the government has failed.
Well, I don't think it suggests that the government has failed. I think it shows that why this government's taking this so importantly, that this is such a priority for the Prime Minister, because it's not just about the actual day-to-day Northern Ireland protocol issues about goods moving back and forth. It's actually about, it is about that, but it's also about getting democracy back to Northern Ireland and trying to sort out that power sharing agreement. We know the DUP won't go back till the Northern Ireland protocol's been sorted, and it's so important that for devolved matters, whether it's health, education, policing, that is up and running. And that's why it's such a priority for the Prime Minister.
So it isn't going to be enough, is it, to sort out the technical issues, as you say, the trading issues, the talk of a red lane and a green lane, so that goods heading for Northern Ireland have far fewer checks, goods headed for the EU, Ireland, will have far more checks. It isn't about that, is it? It's only really about the constitutional issue. And therefore, why did you and others sign up to it in the first place? Because it was very clear what the constitutional issue was.
It's absolutely also about the trading arrangement.
But I think that's been done. I think we get the impression that's been done.
Well, I haven't seen the deal.
Well, let's say
none of us have.
But let's say it has been done. It's not going to be enough, is it?
Well, I think that's why the Prime Minister hasn't announced a deal. He is still in negotiations. Be very clear about that. He wants the absolute best deal for Northern Ireland. And it's, what I found understanding from Keir Starmer was that he would accept anything. Just, get it out of the way. It doesn't matter the implications. It doesn't matter whether it actually helps Northern Ireland. Just get a deal through.
Well, you're shaking your head. But that is what Keir Starmer has said. The Labour Party's just given a blank cheque. He's just said it again today. Don't worry. If you haven't got the support of perhaps Maria Caulfield and others within your own party and behind you on the benches, but we'll be there.
Of course, a deal comes forward, we look at that deal, but if the deal has been done between the European Union and the UK government and the parties in Northern Ireland support it, then we have to assume
but what if the Democratic
we would support.
But if the Democratic Unionist Party says no, we don't support it because we've still got laws being guided, maybe to a lesser extent, by the EU, would you support it?
Well, we have to have a compromise in all of this. This is a situation which is messy. The inevitable implications of Brexit is that it has an impact on the borders, either down the Irish Sea or the land border. The number one priority is to protect the Good Friday Agreement. That is why Keir Starmer has so passionately put forward the case for compromise, because that's the only way any of us are going to get out of this. The reality is there is a Brexit purist cult on the backbenches of the Conservative Party, and they are trying to block this deal because the Prime Minister is also so weak. I mean, what a stark illustration of just how weak he is. Keir Starmer is saying, let's put country before party. Let's put the national interest ahead of trying to play all of these party politics, trying to keep these people happy. You, as he said, never take yes for an answer, and that's why Labour is offering the Prime Minister our support to get this deal over the line.
Well, you know, how is it putting country before party when you would agree any deal that wouldn't resolve the issues in Northern Ireland?
But it's the deal the Prime Minister brings. We're not agreeing any deal.
Well, that's what
the only deal that we'll get a vote on is the Prime Minister's deal.
Keir Starmer has just said he will vote for anything. He said, bring it on. What's the delay? He wants the Prime Minister just to accept anything. The Prime Minister's really focused that whatever we do to the Northern Ireland Protocol...
Are you not going to support the Prime Minister's deal, then?
Well, absolutely. But Keir Starmer said at the dispatch box just now to the Prime Minister, bring anything back. It doesn't matter what it's there.
Bring a proposal, and we vote on the proposal the Prime Minister brings.
It has to be the right proposal.
It's an utterly absurd argument.
It has to be the right... if you bring a deal to Parliament...
If the Prime Minister brings a deal to Parliament...
No, this is what Sir Keir Starmer's suggesting. Bring any deal to Parliament. It doesn't matter what it's in it.
He's saying to the Prime Minister, bring a deal to Parliament.
If that doesn't bring the DUP back to power sharing in Northern Ireland, that does not benefit the people in Northern Ireland. That's why the Prime Minister is taking the time and the effort to bring everyone together.
Whose deal would we be voting on in Parliament? Would it be the Prime Minister's deal?
Well, absolutely, but that's why he's taking the time to do that.
That's what Labour is saying, is we will look at the Prime Minister's
You've just said,
deal.
Bring any deal back. It doesn't matter what's in it.
We're not in government. The Prime Minister is doing the negotiations with the DUP and everybody else, making a hash of it. But hopefully at some point he will bring a deal forward and we are ready to vote on that deal.
Whatever's in it?
We're not. No, we will vote on what the Prime Minister brings forward.
Well, let me just get back to this, the deal as it comes back. Are you saying that the Prime Minister could come back with a deal that doesn't necessarily meet all the tests set by the Democratic Unionist Party and wouldn't lead to a restoration of Stormont?
No, I think the Prime Minister has been very clear this afternoon.
So he has to do that?
He's been very clear that he wants to bring everyone together and he's going to take the time and space to get to do that. Right.
OK, but there would have to be a compromise somewhere. So are you saying that you wouldn't have a border down the Irish Sea? There has to be, according to the EU, some sort of external border. And in order to bring the Democratic Unionist Party back into power sharing in Stormont, would you have a border between Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland?
Well, I think those sorts of issues... I mean, I haven't been involved in the negotiations, but from what Geoffrey Donaldson was saying, they're not the main issues that he's got in terms of the movement of goods. His main concern is about the European Court of Justice and being under EU rules. And that's, I think, where the negotiations are going at the moment. The movement of goods, I think, you know, as you said yourself, it sounds like that has been bottomed out, but there are still issues that need to be dealt with.
How difficult is this for Rishi Sunak? I mean, how dangerous a moment is this in terms of rerunning or echoing those Brexit wars when Theresa May was Prime Minister?
Well, look, I can't say with any certainty just how many Tory MPs would be prepared to rebel on this, but what I can say is speaking to senior Brexiteers, the ones who are really exercised by what we know is in the deal, are very, very adamant that they won't back it as it stands, and they think they have dozens of colleagues who are in a similar place. Again, I've not spoken to any ministers who are threatening to resign, but Brexiteers keep talking about there being ministers who are prepared to stand by their values on this. And in that sense, I think it's a real test of Rishi Sunak. If he tries to push this through without the DUP's backing, there will be a big rebellion in his own party. Just how big and just what exactly that means for him will depend on the size.
Would it be a resignation issue for you?
No, I don't. You know, there is no deal that we are.
No. But could it be? Could it be if red lines are crossed for you? You were pretty staunchly in favour of Brexit.
No, absolutely. But I think we have to recognise the protocol doesn't work now. It doesn't work for the people of Northern Ireland. There is a difference.
Well, it doesn't work for the Democratic Unionist
Party.
Party.
It doesn't work. That GB is different to Northern Ireland, and I welcome that the Prime Minister is trying to sort that out. So for me, there will be an improvement, and so I welcome that move that he sees the priority reality. He sees the consequences of the protocol not working.
All right.
And he wants to sort that out.
Another very big issue that has been ongoing for the past few months is the issue of strikes and the issue of pay for various sectors. Nick, now we had the news yesterday, somewhat surprisingly actually, the nurses had announced they were going to pause their strike action next week because the government, with the intervention of Rishi Sunak, has agreed to intervene and intensive talks. Is there going to be a deal?
Not sure. Again, I think there's much more of an opportunity for one, certainly when it comes to nurses, because the government is prepared now, after weeks and weeks and weeks of saying it wouldn't, to look again at the 2022-2023 pay deal, the thing the unions have always asked. I think there's still a ceiling on what they'd be prepared to offer, which is probably about 5%, because that's the point at which the Treasury reckons it would make inflation more problematic, although that's contested. The one thing that I think is on the table in the talks that are happening this morning, Maria, maybe you can confirm it for us, is the idea of backdating next year's pay deal by a few months to compensate for those cost of living pressures.
So I'm not going to comment on the negotiations because they are, the Secretary of State is heavily involved with the RCN now. And I think, we need to give them the space and time to do that. But I really welcome that the RCN, I think Pat Cullen has acted really responsibly in calling off the strikes to get back round the table and try and sort it out. It's what she's done in Scotland in terms of calling off the strikes there.
Yeah, well, that's because they've offered something in the region of 6.5%. I mean, the point is, why the change of heart by the government?
Well, it's not a change of heart. The door has been opened on pay, and we've
on this year's pay,
yeah,
not or next year's pay, I should say. But the nurses were very insistent. It should look at the year to date, last year's pay settlement. Why the change of heart by the government?
Well, the change of heart is that we want, we have been clear that pay is on the table, and we want to discuss that, and we want to end the strikes, because it's in no one's interest for strikes to be ongoing, particularly for patients. And I think it's welcome that there is, serious negotiations going on right now.
Something you must welcome too.
Better late than never. The big question is why it's dragged on for so long. It really feels like patients have been used as bargaining chips by the government. The government should have been getting around the table with these key workers. We stood on our doorsteps and applauded the nurses through COVID, and I think that it's pretty disgraceful, really, that it's taken this long to get to the negotiating table.
There's strikes in Labour-run Wales as well, and they've not resolved those. So this is happening in all 4 nations.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the funding settlement that the Welsh government gets from the UK government is based on a £3 billion real terms cut since 2010. So we've only got the bargaining tools that we've got to work with.
Well,
but
not,
it's good
not
news.
only in that sense. There are things the Welsh government could
raise
do.
taxes.
Well, no, because there's no the progressive taxation that we want to have. There isn't a strong enough tax base for the top rate of taxpayers in Wales. That's the reality of the Welsh economy.
Would you support, a Labour government support 6.5%, as has been offered in Scotland in terms of a pay rise for nurses?
I'm not going to get into the details of the negotiations. What I simply say is there's a basic duty for government, which is to get around the table and work in partnership rather than this constant confrontational, stirring the pot, looking to stoke culture wars, which I think is what the government's tried to do with the strikes. They have failed. It's good that they're now taking a more pragmatic approach.
I mean, the strikes have worked, haven't they? Maria, in the end, the government has finally seen sense and is saying we will talk about pay, not just this year, but last year.
Well, I do think the strikes have worked. I think they've done a huge amount of damage to patients, and I think that's why...
They've worked with the government, haven't they?
Well, not necessarily. The negotiations are happening, but there's a range of strikes happening. We're not going to, for example, the BMA's demand of a 26%...
That's for junior doctors.
For junior doctors. That's not achievable or realistic. And
what would be achievable and realistic?
Well, junior doctors are in a different position in that they're not under the independent pay review body. They have a multi-year settlement, which is 8.4%.
And lots of them are going to live in Australia.
Which, the unions themselves signed up to. And I don't think striking does mean that that pay in terms of an increase is guaranteed. Negotiations is the way to get this resolved.
Is there a special case for nurses, Maria? I mean, you're a health minister, you're a former nurse. Are there a special case?
I mean, I have to be very careful here because I am both an RCN member and a member of the government. So I wouldn't be involved in the negotiations because I've got a foot in both camps.
No, but do you think they are a special case compared to, you've mentioned junior doctors, compared to the rail drivers and railway staff, teachers? Are they a special case?
I'm not sure that nurses per se are a special case, because when you look at the health service, there are so many key workers that make such a difference, whether it's the cleaners, the porters, the security staff, the doctors, the physios, OT. So what we have to be mindful with the nursing negotiation, and I'm not involved in the negotiation, is they come under what's called agenda for change. And if you change agenda for change for nurses, there are implications that the physios, the OTs are also under agenda for change. So it wouldn't be necessary that nurses are a special case. That's the cost.
Right.
So if you put up nursing by 1% on agenda for change, that's agenda for change across the board.
Are they a special case, nurses? You mentioned the pandemic, of course, and the key role they played, and the clapping for healthcare workers in general. Do you think they hold a special place in people's hearts and therefore should be treated differently on pay?
Working people across our economy deserve fair pay and good terms
Well,
and
everyone would
conditions.
agree
That's
with
how you
that. It's
deliver
what
a
fair pay
productive
is.
economy.
But do you think nurses are a special case?
I think that working people right across the board deserve a fair deal. Of course, what we should be doing is scrapping non-dom tax status to generate £2.3 billion for the Exchequer, which would be used to recruit under Labour's policy tens of thousands more doctors and
But just
medical
on that
staff.
point, Stephen,
that is actually a choice.
The non-dom money.
Do you support non-doms or do you support nurses? It's a very simple question. Politics is about choices.
But the non-dom money, Wes Streeting wants to renationalise GPs and buy out all partners and make them nationalised. That wouldn't even touch the surface of the non-dom money. So this nonsense that non-dom's money would pay for pay rises for healthcare workers, it's been spent about 10 times
What I just
over.
said, it's for recruiting. One of the big problems is morale in the NHS. There's 150,000 vacancies, so nurses are under the cosh because of the abject failure of the government since 2010. But the £2.3 billion pounds is for recruiting more staff. That's what I've just said.
How are you going to pay for the GPs taking them out of their business, practices and nationalising them?
Well, look, we need root and branch reform. We need
policy.
root and branch reform across the
How are you
NHS.
gonna pay
Wes has made it very clear. He said some very interesting things, I think, about making GP surgeries one-stop shops. But there's a fundamental issue around recruitment and retention. And if you choose nurses over non-doms, that's what's
and non-doms. So you
income.
keep saying non-doms. We should say people not domiciled here for tax purposes,
Yes.
which you say would raise £2.3 billion.
Yes.
In terms of the sorts of pay rises that are being demanded, that would still be a drop in the ocean. I mean, it's a significant amount of money, I agree, but it is a drop in the ocean. And there is, of course, as you know, the argument that actually people on non-dom status, not domiciled here for tax purposes, bring in other streams of revenue that help the Exchequer. Do you accept all of that?
There's no evidence at all that abolishing non-dom tax status would lead to the exodus that others talk about. On the point about pay, we need a pay settlement which keeps pace with inflation. If you look at the way public sector workers have had their pay cut massively since 2010, we've got to do something to help those people to keep up with inflation and the cost of living. But naming a percentage, it's not my job.
Would it go? Would it? Would it?
Do that.
Would
That's
it?
about
What would
getting
it do
around the
to
table
inflation?
and having a
What
mature
would it,
approach.
You mentioned inflation. What would it do to inflation? I mean, the government has said that's its sort of core mission. What would pay rises at the level of inflation or above do to prices?
There's no evidence that pay rises below the rate of inflation drive inflation up, particularly for public sector pay. What we're also seeing is the knock-on impact of the war in Ukraine and COVID and supply chain issues is starting to wash through the system. So inflation is actually dropping on its own. Nothing to do with the government, it's just external factors. So as inflation drops, as we, I hope, get a more structured dialogue between the government and public sector workers, we will actually, I hope, be able to get to a better place.
Let's talk about immigration or small boats, as a number of your Conservative colleagues raised this issue. In fact, they seem to be putting Rishi Sunak under a certain amount of pressure. Esther McVey, a former cabinet minister, asking where this legislation is. Where is it, Maria?
So I think the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary are working on legislation which will be challenged. Let's not kid ourselves when it comes through, as we've seen with the plan for Rwanda, when we've tried to deport, even criminal people who've been in prison. We want to deport them afterwards. Every time there's a legal challenge to the work that's been done. So both the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary want to make sure that the legislation comes forward, works from day one, and that's why they're taking some time over.
Unlike the Rwanda plan, which is if people arrive on a small boat, claiming asylum, they'll have their asylum applications processed in Rwanda. And how many people have gone?
Well, that's because it's been challenged in the courts and opposed by the Labour Party. That's why we want to get this right. But there is an urgency about this. There's no doubt that MPs in their constituencies, when we've got hotels with illegal immigrants waiting to be processed, when we're seeing small boats arriving on our shores, of course MPs are concerned about that. They're hearing it from their constituents and they do want the government to take action.
This is your brief, shadow immigration. Stephen, do you agree with Rishi Sunak that it's working, the deals with Albania? This is particularly with the government there about returning people as they see them as economic migrants rather than asylum seekers, and France.
The Albania deal is something that actually was first struck by a Labour government back in the day, and it's good to see that that's finally been put back in place. I think the fundamental point here is that this new piece of legislation that they're all talking about isn't necessary. We had the Nationality and Borders Bill passed back in the summer, hundreds of pages of legislation, and now they're talking about bringing forward a new piece of legislation.
So what would you do?
It's a gimmick, and it's about chasing headlines rather than doing the nitty-gritty work. That means clearing the backlog, getting the right caseworkers and decision makers into...
At least it's a plan, is what people will say. At least it's a plan to tackle something that seems to be a very big issue for many, many people.
But the government's completely lost control of our asylum system. They've had 13 years. We've seen the number of small boat crossings going through the roof. Labour's plan is to resource the NCA properly by scrapping the unworkable Rwanda plan, the National Crime Agency, so that you bring in 100 new experts in a specialist unit that will actually break the people smugglers upstream. It is to bring in decision makers and caseworkers to the Home Office so we can actually start to clear the backlog, because of the backlog that we have people in inappropriate and extremely expensive hotel accommodation. It's about nitty-gritty, doing the hard yards, rather than chasing headlines in tabloid newspapers.
Well, you've had 13 years to deal with this.
13 years.
Well, the Labour's plan is about processing people quicker. The Prime Minister's plan is to stop the boats in the first place, and I think that's the difference. And I think that's certainly what constituents, when I'm knocking on doors, are saying to me, that, we need to stop the process, not process people quicker, but end the small boats legally landing.
The backlog is acting as a magnet. One of the reasons that people are paying
the Prime Minister has promised, as one of his 5-point
because they know that if they get over
the backlog by the end of the year.
If they get over the channel, they're stuck in the completely dysfunctional asylum system for, on average, 400 days.
Do you think we're going to see this legislation anytime soon?
Well, look, I mean, there's definitely been some complications to it. There are some Tory MPs absolutely desperate to see it, particularly before the local elections, because they want something to sell to their voters. We know that the Prime Minister has talked about going to visit President Macron in Paris soon. I suspect that will be high on the agenda there, because a big part of whatever the government strategy on stopping small boats is going to be is going to have to be some closer relationships with Paris. But at the moment, don't have a date for it at all.
Right. I mean, in terms of the backlog, I mean, the government has said it will clear the backlog. I mean, it's a huge backlog of asylum applications by the end of the year. You'd obviously welcome that.
They're going to do what you're... get on and do it, rather than bringing forward new pieces of legislation that aren't necessary. Implement, do the hard yards, do the nitty-gritty work, rather than chasing headlines. It's
been a failure, hasn't it, really, by successive governments? Because the numbers just have gone up, despite promises to bring them down. The small boats still come. You've tried to, well, you have made it illegal for people to use that as a means. Where's the success?
I think the Prime Minister recognises that. That's why he's put it as one of his top 5 priorities, that we haven't dealt with it, but he's determined to fix that.
Thank you very much to Maria Caulfield, Stephen Kinnock, and, of course, to Nick.